Welcome in to the first ever emergency episode of Note News. The Blues have announced this morning that Alexander Steen will take over as the general manager of the St. Louis Blues in the near future. So, what does this mean for the St. Louis Blues, the front office, the players, and the fans? We'll break down all that and more on this episode of Note News. Our first emergency episode, Alec. How are you feeling about emergency Note News?
We'll do anything for the pod.
Anything for
It's
the
an
pod?
exciting one. I think probably something we've seen coming, but at least in the past couple of weeks preceding. But yeah, it's good to have a direction as a franchise as opposed to seeing as I was listening to a piece on Buffalo on the way to here, and I am glad I'm not a Sabres fan. I'll say that much.
Yes, yeah, it's nice to have some direction, like you were saying. So, to get into some background, first of all, so the deal itself. So the Blues had a press conference this morning, June 13th, where they announced that Alexander Steen, the former Blues player, signed a 5-year contract with the Blues. So for the first 2 years of that contract, he'll be a special assistant to Doug Armstrong, learning the ins and outs of the GM position. And then for the following 3 years, he's going to take over as the GM of the Blues. And then Armstrong will sort of step back into being the president of hockey operations. Um, in sort of a joint move with this contract, the Blues also promoted Tim Taylor to join Ryan Miller as an assistant GM. Taylor's going to continue to oversee player personnel, while Miller will oversee salary cap, contract negotiations, and other hockey ops, things like that. So um, Alec, what was your gut reaction to the news when you were watching the press conference this morning? We'll get into a little bit about what it means for the Blues, but like gut reaction, what did you think right away when you saw the news?
I think the first thing I thought was more about Armstrong than it was Steen. It's interesting to see what this will mean for the remainder of his tenure, and I think it's a good sign that it has such a concrete period, because Armstrong throughout his Blues tenure has done a really, for the most part, great job. Bringing this team its first Stanley Cup. However, in recent seasons, he's been more, not quite on the hot seat, but his seat was starting to get warm. And so it almost
Mm-hmm.
feels like they're getting ahead of that with this move. So really, I think this is just, my gut reaction was reassuring that we do have a competent franchise.
Yeah, yeah, I think I had the same reaction. There's like lots of questions. To use a similar example around management for the Cardinals, for example, it's like, will Mozeliak step down or won't he? Like, what's going to happen? And they've offered a little bit of news, but it's nice that as fans of the Blues, Armstrong and Stillman and Steen have sort of come out and said this is the plan, and it's nice and concrete for sure. Um, so a little bit about the history of the deal itself. So what they talked about in this morning's presser was sort of how when Steen retired, they stayed in touch, and then of course last year he joined the front office staff, and they sort of became more familiar with him on that side of hockey and things like that, and so really saw that he could be someone that could take over as GM. But all he was lacking was the actual experience of being a GM. Um, Armstrong came to Tom Stillman, the Blues owner, earlier this year to sort of make the case for a succession plan. It sounded like Stillman was a little bit hesitant to maybe let Doug Armstrong go and wanted him to keep being GM at first, but it he sort of warmed up to the idea, especially when they figured out that Steen would be the guy to do it. There was a lot of talk of Armstrong sort of putting the Blues ahead of himself when he was making decisions. Um, he talked about how he could continue being GM for forever and he'd be happy doing it, but is that what's best for the Blues? So I think that's a pretty good sign, wouldn't you say, that Doug Armstrong would think that way?
Oh, totally. And I think especially that this seems initiated from Armstrong himself. I think it is just another. I promise I'm going to have different things to say, but a really good sign of a well-run franchise. because that does mean that he is thinking more long term, or he's able to accept where he is at his stage in his career. Um, One of the things he brought up in his press conference is that, maybe even subconsciously, he might be thinking more 5 years or so ahead in the future, versus thinking like really long term, like 10, 15 years. And that's why hiring a guy like Steen, who's only 40 years old, they gave him, we'll get into the contracts in a little bit. They gave him a 5-year contract, but they said that they want him to be around for 15 plus years. And
Yeah.
that would mean that things are going well for the Blues. So I think fans should want the same. So the fact that, yeah, Armstrong initiated this, um, and eventually won over his side of the argument, all of this just sort of reeks of good planning and a smooth transition.
Yeah, totally. A little bit of background on Alex Steen for those listening that might not know. So he was, of course, traded to the St. Louis Blues in the 2008 2009 season, and he remained a Blue until the end of his career in 2019 2020. He was, of course, a Stanley Cup champion in 2019, a big part of that team. He also received Selke votes in multiple seasons and actually received some votes for the Hart Trophy in the 2013-2014 season. He was hired June of last year as a sort of a European player development consultant for the Blues, and we saw that come through. We saw that influence in a lot of ways, especially recently, right? With like all of these entry level contracts handed out to players, a lot of whom were from the Swedish Hockey League. Um,
Yep.
do you think I mean, that's obviously probably a pretty big sign that they respected his insight and his opinion, right? Um,
Yeah, totally. I
yeah.
think all of Steen's role throughout, in the past couple of years or so, since he stopped being a player, has really been someone that Armstrong and the front office have always respected his opinion. Someone that Armstrong said that he sometimes would talk to Steen, guys like Steen and Al McInnes, I know was named as well,
Hmm.
before he like made any large moves. So even before he was hired on as a consultant, he was still sort of or was sort of a respected voice in the organization. Then officially got hired to the organization and clearly has his pulse on the European hockey scene, which has always been a strong scene, especially in Scandinavia and Sweden as well. So yeah, it's someone. It's good to see that this isn't just a quick hiring. That it's a guy they like that they want to go with. This is someone that they've respected for the past couple years in their franchise, and that Armstrong really trusts.
Yeah. Yeah, and not only in like with European player development, but also he did a one-on-one interview, like conversation with Drew Bannister during the hiring process for
Yeah.
the Blues head coach. So um, that seemed, a little maybe a little odd at the time that someone in European player consulting would be interviewing a head coach, but maybe that was just a sign of what was to come because here we are. Now he's going to be GM, and so I think they were definitely planning for that at the time, and that was probably a big reason why they had him talk to Bannister throughout the presser. They sort of highlighted Alex Steen's love of hockey in St. Louis and the Blues, and what made him a good candidate. Um, they talked about his hockey knowledge, his leadership, and then of course he's a fan favorite. So, do you think he'll be a good GM? Do you think his ties to St. Louis and his hockey knowledge will make him a successful GM? Sort of, what do you expect out of Alex Steen? Sort of, I know we're only half a day out from the news, but what's your what you know? So what are your sort of uh, first gut expectations about this move?
Yeah, that is the central question, and it is a hard question to answer because it is kind of hard to imagine Steen as a GM without ever
Mhm.
having served any GM role. He just really doesn't have a track record, he hasn't been in a position like that in his career so far. However, I think everything around it, my instant reaction has been pretty positive,
Mhm.
partially because I was such a big Alex Steen fan growing up. He was probably one of three Blues that just made me fall in love with hockey. Um, but ever since his retiring, he's after he took some time for himself and his family. He mentioned that during the pandemic.
Hmm.
When he came back to hockey, and he knew he wanted to be with the Blues organization, there was such a strong bridge of trust between Steen and between the front office as well, both back and forth. And so all of this is really pointing towards being a good decision, a well informed decision that I think I am excited to see. I'm excited to see what Steen brings as a GM as well. We really don't know what his style will be, if he's going to be,
Hmm.
more trigger happy with trades and signings and whatnot, or if he is going to be more reserved. I would imagine it isn't going to be too terribly different, but Armstrong has mentioned that Armstrong throughout his career has made some mistakes, and he's certainly well aware of this. I think a lot of the things that Blues fans now may be upset with him is a lot of the no move, no trade clauses he does, or
Hmm.
signing older guys to longer contracts. And at least in my opinion, from his fervent efforts to try and trade Krug before last season, I think he's learned from this. So I think what we can expect from Steen is sort of a restart on an Armstrong style system,
Hmm.
but with still a lot of the continued success, and potentially some new style of trading and signing and whatever that'll be Steen's own thing that we really can't know until he takes over in 2026. But yeah, as I've been saying, all of this really is just pointing to being a good, safe move that Blues fans should trust.
Sure. Yeah. So they talked a lot about how he sort of was lacking the experience as a GM, and they were like, "Well, you'll get experience on the job." Do you think that lack of experience as a GM, that lack of front office experience, he's only got like a year of it. Do you think that might, I don't know, hinder his ability at all? I mean, yeah, like, what do you think there?
Yeah, certainly is a very unproven talent in the front office system. Again, I'll go back to the point that this is someone that they've trusted to make these decisions even before he had any experience, and that's what the next 2 years of his contract are for. So
Yeah.
Armstrong still has two more years on his GM contract, and it's expected he'll finish that out. And at that point, Steen will take over. And I think that 2 year period plus what he had last year as well, he was in a very similar role. But now he'll see more of like the scouting from other coaches, other parts of the Blues. Really how it's run. And Armstrong will still be in charge, but sort of show Steen the ropes. So it'll definitely be not as much experience. I do think there is something to be said about the type of experience that Steen is receiving now. Arguably, the hardest job of a GM is when the team isn't succeeding. And
Mhm.
last year was overall a success, as we said in our first episode. But the season before, when Steen started to take on an advisory role, really was not. And we'll see how the next 2 seasons of Blues hockey play out as well. There could be a lot of volatility there. So, if anything, Steen, if he were to be started now, would really be thrown into the fire, and I think it would really be a bad sign of potentially, um, we could expect failure, but that's not what's happening. Armstrong is still going to deal with the next couple years of this uncertain Blues time, and I think Steen is really going to benefit from that. So, yes, there is something to be said about his lack of experience, but I still believe in the Blues way and following in Armstrong's footsteps through this difficult time. I think he'll get the experience he needs to get himself started. And additionally, he'll still have that support system of Armstrong as the president of hockey operations and all the rest of the guys around him. He mentioned that he also values that really strong voices around him too. So I think he'll do, even when in scenarios where he doesn't have the answers, he'll do what's right to get them.
Sure. Yeah. So you sort of got into it a little bit there, but we can move on to what this means for the Blues as an organization. Sort of what does it mean for the front office of the Blues? So Doug Armstrong talked about how it's just going to be business as usual for the next 2 years. He'll still be GM, and then as you said, Steen being special assistant to Doug Armstrong will be learning a lot. He'll be with the team. He'll be out scouting with Armstrong and the rest of the staff, and then over time, it seems like Armstrong will start to delegate some of the GM duties to Alex, and then ultimately 2 years from now he'll take over everything. So it sounds like they'll be working pretty closely together over the next 5 years. And like while the short term vision over the next 2 years, sort of as we continue this retool, is sort of under Armstrong with Steen in a learning role, the long term vision for where the Blues are headed is going to be up to Steen. So we're really excited to see how all that plays out. As far as sort of what we can expect um, of of a sharing of responsibilities over the next 2 years, like how much sway do you think that Steen will have in decisions over the next 2 years, especially because obviously when he takes over as GM, he's going to be making a lot of big decisions. But
Right.
do you think he'll be do you think he'll have some say in a lot of like player signings or decisions like that? Do you like how much influence do you expect him to have?
Yeah. I think it will be very similar to how the role he's played with the team over the past couple of years, with a little bit more
Mhm.
influence now, but I don't think it's going to be significant. Armstrong seemed pretty resolute in his press conference that it's still his team, still his vision for the next 2 years, and I think that's true. I do think if there's like some major move that Steen really like says, "Whoa, I need this to not happen for my
Mhm.
vision." I think there's a good chance that Armstrong would listen and capitulate, so long as it isn't like so contrary to what he wants to do. So I
Mhm.
do think Armstrong's still going to be the prevailing voice here. I do think, yeah, Steen will be probably almost like his closest advisor and loud and he'll run all of his ideas through him, but it's more so of a teaching role for Steen than it is Steen giving his input to Armstrong.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. For anyone listening that doesn't know sort of the difference between a general manager and a president of hockey operations, which is what Doug Armstrong will be sort of stepping back to. So a GM really deals with all things that have to do with players, like roster construction, player drafts, signing free agents, trading players, things like that. While the president of hockey operations is sort of he will operate above the GM, will sort of be his boss, can veto certain decisions, but has more to do with like overall franchise operations, like economics and finance, things like that. Um, so with that in mind, um, Armstrong talked about how with these extensions and these contracts sort of working out, they're at a point where they're making decisions based on veteran players, younger players sort of entering their prime and things like that, um, and looking for someone who can look past sort of their personal contract. So, looking for example, of course, with Alex Steen, they wanted someone like him that could look past just the 5 years of his contract, can look 15 years into the future, and can make decisions that really affect the long term success of the organization. So, what does it mean to you, like that they're using numbers like 15 years when talking about Alex Steen? Like, I mean, that seems pretty significant.
Yeah, and I think it should be, and I hope that they're right, pretty much. But I have no reason to think otherwise, and everything around it just feels really good. So yeah, Steen is the long term plan. This is their what they're playing for. Somewhat show with their hand, but I think with a decision like this, that's the right thing to do, and it shows that this franchise has vision, has direction, and wants to. It isn't willing or isn't just complicit with hanging on to things, trying to grasp on to the last straws of a formerly good regime.
Hmm.
No, they want to like move forward and compete into the future. And I mean, if that isn't exciting as a sports fan, I really don't know what is. Steen certainly still has to prove himself as a GM and as a someone working in the front office. But I mean, with a move like this, like with Steen being as young as he is, this could be an absolute home run for the Blues if he
Yeah.
is able to stick around for that 15-year number or more, or maybe a couple years less, whatever.
Hmm.
This could really be something that sets us forward as a franchise for a long time.
Yeah, totally agree. And thinking more short term as we start to move on here, do you think this will impact the this coming offseason for the Blues, the draft at the end of this month, well, in a couple weeks, and then signing players, trades? Do you think we haven't really fleshed this out yet, but do you think it'll impact this summer at all?
That's what I've really been wrestling with the whole day.
Hmm.
Um, I think the draft is more intriguing to me, so I'll speak quickly on the offseason. I'd like to think that the Blues already had a plan for the offseason, the players they want to target, and most likely Steen was involved in making that plan. So I probably don't think this changes their because this is also not a decision that they just made. They've also known about this decision probably for some time now.
Hmm.
So most likely their offseason plan hasn't changed. I do think the draft is interesting. There's a good chance I was looking too much into it, but in some of the comments made in the press conference today, I know Armstrong commented on the fact that we have multiple picks.
Hmm.
I think what he means by this is multiple like top 50 picks. Where you're hoping you get good talent.
Hmm.
At first, I thought, okay, well, the fact that there's multiple means they want to use them means we're not moving up. But then later, he made a comment about some of the really high end talent and really just doing the right things for this franchise moving forward, which would be getting a number one defense prospect. So, I
Hmm.
mean, I'm just really fascinated to see what the Blues will do in the draft. I think I ended up kind of back to where I started. And I don't think this changes the plan for their acquisitions. I do think Steen he's always had more of a advisory role, especially in like player scouting, youth player scouting.
Hmm.
So potentially there could be more of an impact on the draft. But I think in terms of what we will see and receive, it's still going to feel the same.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Um, I hope they trade up. I want a good defenseman so bad, and we're gonna break
Yeah.
down. We're gonna do a draft preview. I think next week. So stay tuned for that. We'll dive into that. But oh, that would be so nice because what we need is not going to be left at pick 16. Anyways, so that's a little bit about what this contract and this situation means for the front office and the organization. But what does this mean for the St. Louis Blues on the ice, the actual players and the team itself? Um, in this morning's presser, Armstrong mentioned that he called the player leadership group to tell them tell them about this plan and the vision that they have both on the ice and off the ice. Um, and he sort of talked about how the vision on the ice for today's players isn't about when Steen will take over. It's about what we do this year in training camp. They also told this is a good thing and a little bit funny is that they told this player leadership group, their job as players is to disrupt the front office's plan. So by that,
Yeah.
I think they mean, we're going through this retool and, we're not necessarily trying to compete for a Stanley Cup, over the next year or two or three, hopefully it doesn't go that far, but over the next year or two. But their job as players is to screw up that plan, which I think is a good thing to tell them, um, it's a
Hmm.
good, I feel like it's a good realistic view of where the Blues are. It's like we have this plan and we're gonna be doing this plan because we need to get better, but go for it. Like prove us wrong and compete. Um, so they really want the players to show the front office like we're ready and we're ready to compete, make this team better, um, and uh, build around us. So um, how do you think, in addition to some of those things, how do you think this move will affect the actual team on the ice, the players themselves?
I mean, Steen was always a good locker room guy, so
Hmm.
I'm not sure how much of a role Armstrong takes in like daily practices and such. Anyway, I would expect very little, but
Yeah.
it'll be a good face to have around that a couple of the players did play with. So that's fun. I would assume there probably isn't much of an impact on the team on the ice. except for perhaps like changes in the coaching staff that it could bring about, which it's really hard to say, but that could happen. Um, I think the players are still just as motivated as ever, and know what they need to do in the front office. I agree with what you said, that it does feel like they're being very real about the Blues situation, which is
Yeah.
again just such a reassuring thing to see, so that we don't become the Sharks.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be a bummer. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, as a former player, I feel like he'll be able to build a good rapport with the players, and as you said, as a good locker room guy. So that'll be interesting to see for sure. Um, but what does this mean for the fans? So we've sort of talked about the team itself, but what does this mean for Blues fans? Um, I think in the near term, maybe not so much. It seems like, as we say, business as usual for the next 2 years. Things probably won't change all that much for Blues fans. But as you touched on, sort of at the top of the episode, and as we sort of talked about throughout, I think that I don't want to tell fans how they should feel, but I think they should feel excited about this. You know, the Blues have a direction, and
Yeah,
they're being intentional and building a plan, and they're thinking and acting intentionally, especially during a retool. So they're not just doing a player retool. It doesn't seem like they're doing a front office sort of retool as well, which I think should build some reassurance and some confidence that in the team itself, that it has a direction, and they're not just sort of spinning in circles. Would you agree with that?
yeah, absolutely. That's a really creative take on it, a front office retool. I like that a lot. Um, but yeah, I mean, as a player, it was hard to find a more loved guy than Alex Steen on the ice. Just
Hmm.
the toothless wonder, like
Yeah.
absolutely. Everyone loved watching that guy play, and I was so happy to see him lift the Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I mean, the only other thing I could think of for fans is like, look out, perhaps we'll see maybe some more familiar faces returning to the front office. I know Paul Stasny was named in the conference as like
Hmm.
Steen's best friend,
Yeah.
so that'd be kind of funny. Get him on coaching and just teach him how to body check everybody in the central.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it really does. All of this just feels to be pointing in the right direction, and just as there is the eye test in sports, I think there is kind of a vibes check in sports
Yeah.
as well, and vibes are high right now in St. Louis Blues fandom. That is,
Yeah.
um, Steen's hiring and anniversary of the cup. I mean, how could you not be romantic about hockey?
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, and that brings us to our last bit before we close out here. But happy belated We Went Blues Day. 5 years ago yesterday, June 12th, the Blues won their first Stanley Cup in franchise history. It was super fun seeing all of that, throwback content all over social media. So an exciting couple of days, as you say, for St. Louis Blues hockey fandom. Um,
Yeah,
and it does seem like not players. It does seem like fans are pretty happy with the news of Steen's contract. The comments in the live stream and social media seems to be pretty positive. And
absolutely.
as far as Steen's performance as GM in a couple of years, we'll see what happens when we get there. But I think we're feeling pretty positive about it as of right now.
Absolutely.
So what you can expect from Note News moving forward. We're going to do a draft preview episode next week, so be on the lookout for that. The NHL draft is June 28th and 29th, I
28th.
believe. Yeah. And so we'll do a preview and then a recap after the draft, and then we're going to do some off-season content. So be on the lookout for all that. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. Like this video if you're on YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Give us good reviews on all the podcast platforms, all that good stuff. But thanks for tuning in to our first emergency episode. We'll see you next time, and let's go Blues.
Let's go Blues.